So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Colin and Luke, and thanks so much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting us to chat with you about this piece of work, this paper, which, as you say, is called the snappy title, Creating Conducive Conditions for Relational Practice in Adolescent Safeguarding Systems. Start just by introducing myself and then inviting my co-author Luke to introduce himself. So I'm Colin Michel. I'm director and co-founder of Resonant Collaboration, an organisation I've co-founded with another strategic and adolescent safeguarding expert, Rachel Ringham. We work as facilitators, consultants and researchers to help make sense of youth safeguarding and collaboration. And just very recently, I finished working on a safeguarding practice review with the partnership in Slough, which has partly inspired the work on this paper today. Over to you, Luke.
Afternoon all, I'm Luke. I'm a youth worker at Hackney Quest. It's an independent youth charity in Hackney, as the name suggests. I've been there about a decade working with young people one-to-one who are facing difficulties, and then co-leading a range of neighbourhood projects. Hackney is an area that's going through rapid change, and a big focus of my role has been ensuring that young people are informed about, ideally involved in, and certainly benefiting from the way that the area is changing. That's been the kind of guiding thread of the projects I've done there. And then I'm also a researcher at the Open University, and the research that I've been doing is focused on violence reduction, policy making, and then other topics in relation to young people's safety, young people's well-being, and social infrastructure for young people as well. Is it the plan slide? Oh yeah, I'm the slide. Yeah, this is going to happen. I need to adjust to this. Colin's usually the slide guy, but he's got a misbehaving Mac, so I'm the slide guy. So this is the plan, 5-point plan. Firstly, briefly talking about our motivations behind why we're interested in this topic, why we wrote the paper that we wrote. And just to be clear, the paper is like a freely available online thing that you'll get sent the link to. Colin's going to talk about a scenario that kind of exemplifies a lot of the stuff from the paper. I'm going to talk about constraints on relational practice within the system. And when I say I don't mean I mean we are going to talk about that. So I'm going to talk a bit about the approach to relational practice that we articulate in the paper, and then we're going to talk together about what can constrain, what can negatively affect those kind of relationships. Colin's going to talk about creating conducive conditions for relational practice, the kind of framework, the kind of model for that we articulate in the paper. And then it says questions, but we're hoping it'll be questions / discussion at the end with reflections on everything that we've been discussing henceforth. Hope that looks all right and sounds all right. So to start with number one, I'll briefly say a bit about my motivation to write with Colin about this topic. Like most of the things I write, I was motivated by a kind of niggling long-term frustration. Relational practice is something that can get bandied around a bit, and at worst, I think practitioners of various kinds are expected to just do relational practice with insufficient acknowledgement or attentiveness to the demands, the difficulties, and the tensions that are often there when forming relationships with young people in significant difficulties. Teaching being one example. It's palpably ridiculous to say to a teacher, you need to form good relationships with young people if they are under enormous stress, under enormous audit pressure, they don't have supportive management, etc., etc. But the same applies to varying degrees and in different ways. For a lot of practitioners working with young people, we have to be thinking about the conditions around that practitioner rather than just telling them to do the relational practice. So the question that kind of guided the paper at the start was, what would it take to nourish and sustain the conditions for relational practice in every organization, institution, and service that works with children and young people? Over to you, Colin, on your motivation.
So my motivation had been rumbling for about 20 years, if I'm honest. So for the first 10 years of my career, it was 2004, 2014, I'd worked mostly with community organisations, school staff and youth workers. And that was across Yorkshire at first and then later in London. And honestly, I'd seen relational practice, collaboration, partnership and really good conditions in action. But then as things changed, I ended up working more as a a consultant with safeguarding partnerships, and most of my goal was around kind of taking what I'd learned from community-based and education-based contexts and trying to apply it in these multi-agency safeguarding contexts. And speaking to colleagues throughout that time, it seemed that there was a need to shift a focus away from constantly asking individuals to do it themselves, to do relationships themselves, and think differently as a system, and think differently in the wider context. And I got really interested in what was stopping that from happening, that what was stopping us from thinking properly about relationships at the levels of management, leadership, and policy making. And also the observation that in lots of our strategies and policies, we use the words. So we say we're relational, or we say we're trauma informed, and then you chat with middle managers and they say, I don't even get time to think about that, let alone do it. So when I got talking to Luke about how do we understand that better? How do we understand what both facilitates and inhibits our collective capacity for change in a way that's aligned with relational ways of working? So we got started on a paper. So I'm going to begin with a scenario. I want you to imagine that you're a qualified social worker, which in this room is probably pretty easy to do. I want you to imagine that as a qualified social worker, you're actually working for a national youth work charity, and your role is embedded alongside local authority adolescent support team, and they are working with young people who are currently experiencing risks and harms. Those tend to be risks and harms from violence, exploitation, but those are also young people experiencing other forms of inequality. You get to work directly with young people over slightly longer periods of time than your colleagues in social work teams. You work closely with alternative provision settings, youth justice team, and children's social care teams, including, of course, when it's within a child protection context, IROs and child protection chairs. You've known Saif since he was 13. You know that Saif's family have been known to local authority children's services on and off since Saif was 7. There's been a number of referrals for help and support for that family throughout their life, and an early help plan or two arising from concerns about things like persistent absence, multiple suspensions from school, missing episodes, and domestic abuse at home. There's not been recently a child protection plan, though there has been a child in need plan. When Saif was 14, he was getting into fights with other students and threatened to injure another student with a knife. He was permanently excluded from the mainstream secondary school he was at. When Saif was 15, he said that you were the only adult he trusted. He's now 16, and it feels like you've stopped getting through to him. He skips your meetings and has stopped turning up to his alternative provision setting. You worry speaking to the police could further damage his trust in you. In supervision with your manager, you describe feeling overwhelmed and fearful that Saif might be harmed and do harm to others. You reflect on these feelings, but you remain uncertain how to create safety with Saif in spaces beyond your one-to-one relationship, because you feel like you're missing out on information about what's really going on. Now imagine that you're a social work team manager in the local authority. You run weekly meetings where practitioners from different services come together to discuss ways to safeguard young people from serious violence and exploitation. They call it the weekly contextual safeguarding meeting. Many have been excluded from mainstream secondary schools. Some are missing, some have had experience of the youth justice system. You feel a lot of pressure to allocate resources both widely and wisely. There's not a lot of early help resources around, and the targeted early help team are really stretched. You feel really angry about public callousness toward young people's welfare, and you're reporting a sharp increase in demand over 6 months. Senior managers at the multi-agency partnership meeting have considered trying to make more resources available for direct practice with young people at risk of harm, but it's tricky. Now imagine that you're a superintendent for the local policing area. You chair quarterly meetings alongside your fellow strategic leaders from community safety, education, healthcare, social work, and sometimes housing. Your shared aim is safeguarding children from harm, and you analyse data and you talk about the resources available. They call the meeting, or they used to call the meeting, the multi-agency child exploitation, but you've heard that they're going to start calling it MARV, but you're not quite sure what that stands for. You're worried that local practitioners are avoiding sharing information that could help the police to prosecute young perpetrators of violence. Weapons injuries and child exploitation are rising. The police must act to disrupt violence and to disrupt crime. You raise your concerns at the meeting and explore your position with the group, but they propose deeper analysis of violent incidents and unsafe spaces, and the group discusses participatory work with children and with practitioners to see if there's more opportunities for creating safety within peer groups. They agree to reallocate what limited existing resources are available to support more children at risk of harms, but you don't feel that's solved your issue. Over to you, Luke.
So that scenario hopefully sets the scene of different players and begins to imply different kinds of opportunities and constraints that are there in different bits of the system in relation to relational practice, both relationships between practitioners and young people and relationships in the system of adults around that. So what I'm going to do now is briefly describe the approach to, or the kind of conceptualization of relational practice that we use in the paper, before then together as a group we'll start talking about the various constraints that exist on those forms of relationship. I've got a couple of caveats first. Caveat one is that obviously we wrote this paper based on research that we've done directly or secondary literature and our experiences within safeguarding systems and in different positions. And this bit of the paper draws fairly heavily on my experience as a youth worker working directly with young people in Hackney. And of course, I'm conscious that other parts of the safeguarding system have practitioners who have different forms of relationship with young people. And obviously an IRO role has a particular kind of orientation to the system as a whole and to individual young people. So I'll bear that in mind, and I'm sure that will come out in the discussion, those different fundamental natures of those different kinds of relationships. And the second caveat is just that what we do not want to do is suggest that this is the model for relational practice or even the best way of thinking about it. We find it quite intuitive and we think it's quite helpful, and we think that it's compatible with other approaches to this deriving from ambit or systemic training or CBT or whatever other kinds of training or framework that people use. But we don't wish to present this as kind of the answer in any kind of way. So with those caveats in mind, I'll explain from what we put in the paper how we approach relational practice. So first of all, we talk about authentic alliance, that bit at the bottom. And this is the kind of common understanding of and commitment to the relationship that needs to be there on both sides for the relationship to even begin to start to work. And sometimes I think about how that alliance needs to be good enough in order to function. So the child psychoanalyst Winnicott talks very famously about the need for there to be a good enough parent. And I think there's something about these alliances needing to be good enough to achieve what they need to achieve. So in my experience working with young people, sometimes the alliance I have with a young person is incredibly deep-seated and strong and feels incredibly resilient. And my relationship with them is a significant part of their lives. Like they're experiencing relational poverty. They haven't got many strong connections or relationships in their life. And therefore I'm a significant presence in their life. And my relationship with them is a significant relationship for them. So as a consequence, that requires a strong alliance. In other cases, for whatever reason, my relationship with that young person is a dot in the ocean of a much wider ranging kind of context for them in terms of both personal and professional relationships. So what that means for the alliance is that it's different in nature. What counts as a good enough alliance in that context is different. Secondly, the word authentic is obviously important here. All of the research with young people about what they want from a worker or what counts as a good relationship with a worker tends to refer to authenticity or genuineness of one kind or another, which can be a challenge because any of us working with young people, I think at times can be pulled in towards a kind of insecure spark chasing, where you're trying to get that spark with a young person. So you're trying to talk about trainers or music or something that you think might be cool in order to superficially get a spark going, but in a manner which might be inauthentic. And so the word authentic is really important there, and may take a large amount of time to achieve, which is going to be a recurrent theme here. So that's a little bit about what an alliance might be, or what it might consist of or vary. And then we talk about attunement. We talk about attunement as a kind of socio-emotional capacity for connectedness. And to achieve attunement with anyone in any context requires a kind of deep attentiveness, a kind of attentiveness that is the gateway towards actual communication, grounded in a degree of understanding of what are they thinking, what are they feeling. And that attunement, a bit like the alliance, can come at different levels depending on the nature of the relationship that you have. And again, thinking about young people I work with, that basic level of attunement, so that I feel like actually there's some communication happening, can take 5 minutes or can take 3 or 4 years really to establish itself. And that kind of relational resonance can take different levels of time. The youth justice practitioner and academic Andy Briley talks about PACT or PACT. He talks about presence, attunement, connection, and trust, and suggests there's a kind of progression between those 4 things. The attunement bit is key. The attunement bit is the bit that then enables the connection to develop and then enables the trust to flourish as well. If connection is like a kind of radio signal where there's a functioning signal, functioning connection between the 2 people, the attunement bit is the tuning in. And as that suggests, it's an ongoing task. Attunement is something that can be fragile and is something that can be lost. And a key part of relational work with somebody is keeping that dial in the right place and keeping tuning in on an ongoing basis. And that's complicated for a whole raft of reasons, one of which is social identity. All of the social graces, the degree to which you're socially proximal or distant from that person you're working with, will affect how smooth or easy or tense or difficult it is to get to that or to achieve that good enough level of attunement. And of course, as well, it's affected by all of the relational complexities in the worker's life, in the young person's life, both previous experiences and current experiences that will, of course, affect attachment, approach, and all the rest of it. And all of those difficulties, all of those complexities are in some cases obstacles that can be navigated, difficulties that can be overcome. In other cases, they're more substantial barriers to achieving attunement and require a lot more reflection and work. And it can be painful. Attunement with a young person experiencing substantial difficulties can be emotionally painful. I describe it as a bit like getting into the stinging nettles with that young person. You're there alongside them. So to a degree, vicariously, you're kind of feeling what they feel. You're immersed in the kind of pain, the pressure, the powerlessness, the trappedness that they might be experiencing. So that's a bit about what we mean by attunement. Analysis then on the left is, by definition, obviously more of an analytical kind of capacity, a more cognitive capacity. And this is where you're a bit more of a distance. You're detaching yourself somewhat from the young person in order to think through their situation. So that may involve different kinds of case formulation, genograms, whatever kinds of assessment tools that may be at your disposal to get at what are the significant relationships in their life, what are the risks and harms they may be facing, and so on. And if attunement is about getting in the stinging nettles with that young person, analysis is a bit more like trying to get up in the bird's nest above those stinging nettles to see how did they get into that situation in the first place, what might be a route out, how extensive are these nettles, who else might be around. And that analytical exercise of assessing in depth the situation that the young person is in can of course be done with others, can be done after the fact of being there with the young person in a multi-agency context or in a kind of supervisory context, but not always. So attunement and analysis are often things you have to do together or kind of oscillating between while you're there with the young person. And I think that can be a key challenge and a key demand of relational practice with young people. You're kind of shuttling it in the moment between a warm form of deep engagement and connection and then a potentially more abstract kind of almost diagrammatic exercise of thinking in depth about that young person's situation. So it requires both a kind of capacious reservoir of emotional resources to achieve that kind of connection and retain it, but then also a kind of flexible repertoire of analytical tools for thinking about their situation from various angles in order to get at kind of what's really going on for them. And then lastly, on the right, we talk about awareness, and it may not be visible, but on that young person's hoodie is the word agency. So we talk about how ultimately, when you're undertaking relational practice, young people, in order to aid their safety, their well-being, what you want to be cultivating is awareness and agency in support of that young person's safety and well-being, so that the young person achieves a kind of self-awareness and an understanding of their social ecology in order to understand what is pulling them or pushing them towards safety, towards well-being. And it may be more particular forms of awareness and agency that you may focus on depending on the focus of your work. So for instance, if there's a young person who's been in a pattern of entering into different kinds of abusive relationship, then there may be a particular focus there on developing their awareness and their agency to both understand those kinds of patterns and what's driving them, and the agency to be able to avoid or to extricate themselves from those forms of relationship. So that's a lot of A words that we use to convey the complexities involved in relational practice, particularly thinking about working with adolescents in a safeguarding context. And I think hopefully this substantiates what I was saying earlier about the demands and the complexities of this. This is not something that can be done on the cheap. This is not something that can be done very speedily and easily by anyone, especially when there's a whole raft of different kinds of constraints operating on all four of those A words, on both the practitioner and the young person. So if that's a decent kind of working approach to the complexities of relational practice, this is the key first question that we'd like to have a discussion about. So in your experience, in your current roles, previous roles, whatever it may be, what are the most prominent, most significant kinds of constraints and barriers that can negatively affect the potential for these kind of capacities to develop and this kind of relational practice to flourish? You can put your hands up and then we'll come to you to contribute verbally. You can put stuff in the chat and let's get some chat going. Gary.
Sorry, just looking for the mic button there for a second. So for me, as a social worker, or when I was doing social work, I think one of the biggest barriers I used to continue to face when working with adolescent, some of the adolescent teens, what I used to find was that police intelligence was only ever considered as intelligence only, and you couldn't share or discuss that. So early intervention used to be a bit of an issue, and trying to put things in place to kind of prevent that young person from continuing with that lifestyle. And you had to wait until worst case scenario occurred before you could actually do something with it. So I think, yeah, it was all right. Lots and lots of intelligence being shared by the police during your regular MACE meetings and so forth. But it was ineffective because you couldn't really do anything with it other than collect information. So it was pretty pointless at that point.
And it meant that the point at which intervention was possible was a point at which it'd be incredibly difficult to form a kind of alliance or relationship with the young person, I'd imagine.
Absolutely, because you'd already missed the window of opportunity on a number of occasions. You could have stopped it. For me, early intervention was key. Stop it whilst it was just forming, and try and avoid it, but you couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
Because then, yeah, so that's one of the frustrations I used to find quite often.
And that makes me think two quick things. One is about the receptiveness of a young person to a new adult, or the receptiveness of a young person to a professional helping adult, and the factors that affect that receptiveness. So like you say, as problems get deeper, as situations get harder, even though there may be a greater need for professional help from an adult, the receptiveness from the young person for that relationship may not be there, may decline. There may be a lot of good reasons why trust, rapport, relationship is very difficult to establish. The other thing is thinking about which practitioners and professionals are in that young person's life at different stages. And so when the police were sharing that intelligence, and when there was a lot of information about that young person, presumably somewhere in the system, if we're thinking about schools and youth services, wherever else, there were people who were in a position to do the relational work at that point. And who's getting around those practitioners? What support and training have they got to do that kind of early preventative work if it isn't possible to be done elsewhere? If that makes sense.
There's some really interesting comments in the chat there that link to this experience of different roles in the young person's life. A couple of colleagues have mentioned the changes in social work practitioner in the young person's life, and having previously had negative experiences with workers, that breaks down future opportunities for trust building. Somebody's mentioned in relation to the IRO role that we must not try to undermine the social worker and child relationship. I am worked with IROs in various contexts, although never been one, but I'm conscious that there is a bridge position. There's a position where you're both witness and have influence, and also trying to ensure that we hear the child's voice and experience at the same time. So you're kind of in a number of psychic places and cognitive places at once. That is something that we've tried to explore even in this core bit, isn't it, Luke, in terms of being in one relational and then another relational place at once.
And that point about the changes of social worker, I was talking to a head of a virtual school who was talking about cases where a young person has had however many different social workers, but also however many different educational settings as well in their life. So the extent of the volatility and kind of precariousness and transience of all the relationships and institutional settings in their life has kind of militated against this kind of relational receptiveness. Marion, can I come to you, please?
Yes, I mean, I agree with what people are saying, especially kind of outside what is a huge difficult factor, as people have spoken about already, where young people have lots of changes in their lives. So as an IRO, I witnessed that. So if you, especially troubled young people, because once they get into that, where they move in placements and those placements are not suitable, then they become cynical, understandably, because, it's like, well, they don't spend enough time sometimes in some of those placements, depending on how troubled they are. So they don't get to build relationship with the people who are working with them. And then if they hit adolescence as well during that time, the peers become more important to them. So there's a bit where I am often the most longest professional in their life. So there's a period of attunement, but equally there's those difficult bits about like their experience and how that makes them cynical about the system, and basically I think get to a point where I would say moves really work against forming like really good relationship with young people. The more moves they have, the more difficult it is. And unless sometimes this does happen, that in the process of that move, you do get a really good placement that can get hold of that young person, because you're at that stage where the peers become more important. And if they've had the changes of social worker, the changes of placement, and then they also, I think because of how they see themselves, are more vulnerable to forming relationships that are actually work against their interests. They haven't built up that strength in terms of, like, I think you said earlier on, in terms of like, that agency, kind of like knowing, okay, this person is maybe fun to be around, but if I see trouble, I need to know when trouble is coming and kind of walk off in the opposite direction. So I think those are kind of really the difficulties I would say I kind of like would face in terms of trying to kind of create those conducive conditions,
And as you say, the nature of the placement will be a significant kind of determinant. Like if there's a really excellent placement that has helped to affirm a young person's sense that adults can be trusted, that there are good relationships they can form with adults, then that's one thing. If the placement is far more kind of dysfunctional than that, then very much less so. And I guess it goes back to the point about a kind of good enough alliance as well. I guess I'm interested in this idea that in the IRO role, you need to have a certain kind of alliance with a young person, but what counts as good enough for that kind of purpose, I think, is an interesting question, and its depth or otherwise. Adam.
Luke, one point just to say while we're in the conversation, the slides aren't showing to participants, even though they're showing to me and you, so we might want to stop sharing and reshare.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, Sharon, I'll also send you the presentation so that we can test that just while we're in conversation.
Adam.
Lovely. I feel honoured because I can actually see the slides, so I don't know if it's a bit sporadic, but yeah, no worries. Yeah, I suppose I'm just building on from the point about the changes of social work, because I feel as an IRO often that I might work really hard to try and build a relationship with a young person in a meeting, and we might come up with a plan that the young person sort of signed up for, and these things are really going to help me, and we we get to a place where we've got a good plan. But then I'm very reliant, obviously, on the system around me and those things actually happening. So very often I find, and I think it's potentially, well, I work for an inadequate local authority, but I'm sure the colleagues experience the same thing, that we come up with a plan, the young person sort of signed up for it, there's sort of a bit of a sort of trust there that this is what's going to happen, and then those things just don't happen, and there's huge delay, and some of the things don't happen. So the trust that I have with that young person, it's almost like, well, you sort of said these things were going to happen, and then they didn't happen, and I think that definitely impacts on my relationship with that young person in terms of that trust and that following through with things. So it's the sort of external organisation that you work for, and how that impacts on your sort of personal relationship, I think, was the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, I think there's something about that kind of setting is like the container or the nest in which that relationship is formed, and that can be conducive or non-conducive, that can be kind of healthy or unhealthy, that kind of, like you say, a raft of consequences in terms of the young person's perception of other helping adults. What I'll do, I think we're going to move on, aren't we, Colin? So at this point, I'll try closing and then reopening the slides in a slightly different way. This is live PowerPoint, or PowerPoint Live, which I've never done before, which was always going to be a risk. So I'll try and do a more old school form of sharing.
And in a neat segue, Luke, while you're doing that, I will continue with the chat. So we've started to explore some of the constraints and barriers. And it's worth saying how we've used those terms. We're conscious that some things are movable. Some of the kinds of things that hinder practice can be removed or not within our day-to-day relationships. Some constraints are set for us within protocols, legislation, and so on, and are more difficult to shift and require changes in structural and system conditions. And in the paper, we describe various different forces that make relational practice more challenging. I can see in the chat that some people can now see it. Fantastic. I'll describe just a few of these, some of which link directly to what we've just said in conversation, which is helpful. Others have arisen from both our research conversations and since giving this talk in different places, we've learned about different types of constraints and barriers faced by people like school staff, local authority education leaders, sports practitioners, and youth workers. So we're learning about how system conditions contain a range of constraints and barriers. So practitioners have consistently told me, whether in youth work or social work roles, that one kind of constraint from their point of view is that strategies that contain relational practice don't actually make much difference to what they do day to day, that it's named at the level of a local authority strategy or policy, or a safeguarding partnership policy. Now you can imagine that as someone who's spent quite a few years writing strategies, that gives me pause for thought, that we're writing these documents that don't actually trickle down through learning and development programs, supervision, and everyday practice. And I think it's worth keeping in mind when we're thinking about what we call conducive conditions, that do make a difference to practice, thinking about the kinds of learning and development that's ongoing, that's effective. Now, Luke mentioned that the task of attunement itself is tough. Luke, I think we should be on slide 5. I'm now seeing it all as a flat screen, but hey, I guess you can do it from my story. And he also mentioned that there's quite a lot of emotional intensity involved in that direct work. And part of what I'm about to set out in terms of the constraints of different parts of the system is that task of attunement doesn't end just between the young person and the practitioner. At various different stages, we're trying to establish deep connection and relatedness between ourselves as practitioners. Yeah, Marion mentions that we're still on the first slide. I still see it as the first slide, Luke. Don't know if we can get it onto slide 5. And one of the questions when facing that level of emotional intensity is, how do you avoid the reaction and overreaction in the face of really intense negative emotions felt by the young person, or indeed felt by colleagues in another practice role? Yay, I can see it now. We are on the right slide, I think. I'll wait to see in the chat if other people are on the side. I'm on the bottom one, which is doing relational practice with young people. You might be familiar with this intense experience, either from direct work with children, young people and families, where you realise through what we might call intense emotional and quite complex experience that you have to then strengthen your capacity for self-soothing, that you yourself have to stop and think, where is this emotion coming from? You might even have to rip yourself out of that. I'm just spotting somebody saying that they're still on the first slide, whereas I'm now seeing the right slide. So I think, anyway, we'll keep trying. And for those who got difficulties with the slides, I'll do my best to, oh, somebody else is seeing the right slide, but I'll do my best to make it clear from what I'm saying. You'll be in that situation where you're having to self-soothe while also ripping yourself out of that emotional engagement and think fast to respond to something that's going on in front of you, and using your kind of emotional reasoning, relating, sometimes having to say something immediately to respond to the difficult situation. And again, this is not only in direct work with a young person, this is sometimes also in your direct work with other professionals. Another challenge that we talk about in the paper, and I've been exploring with managers, is that while you're doing attunement, and if you're particularly good at it, the better you are, the less it appears like it's effort. Youth workers, family practitioners and social workers will know about this, but the kind of doing relationships is actually an emotional labour. You're having to really think and feel carefully about what you're doing when you're doing it and how you control emotion. And if it looks like an expression of innate qualities, that can imply that some people are somehow, because of their identity or their personality, inherently better than others, which in a sense diminishes the effort and practice that goes into this at the level of practice management and learning and development professionals as well. That can have quite demeaning effects on what is actually quite a complex practice, including lack of recognition. In fact, what we promote is the idea that these kinds of capacities have to be honed through ongoing practice, relational conversation, deep reflection, and reflective supervision. But there is a practical gap that opens up at the level of professional development as well. So while practitioners are trying to prioritise welfare, safety, and the outcomes of awareness and agency that Luke described, managers are facing limited resources. And some of the comments in the chat were about not having the time to engage in this kind of relationship, likewise not having the time to prioritise more substantial learning and development that builds enduring relationships. And practitioners who are working directly with young people tell me it's not training that they crave. They're not puppies. It's actually substantial learning and development to test out, discuss, explore the use of these skills. And for those in management and senior management roles, very often they find themselves hearing about the idea that training is a priority, but not able to get into reflective spaces to engage in some of these issues. That practical and then to a certain extent emotional gap can introduce interpersonal tensions. So we do end up in the situation where a number of disagreements and misunderstandings emerge about what relational practice looks like. And so one to always clear up is, this is not about saying that all types of professionals should be doing relationships in the same way. Clearly, a police officer does their job in a different way than an independent reviewing officer, who does their job in a different way than a classroom teacher. But it is beneficial for us to think about what are the common principles for practice that prioritise welfare, safety and agency across our system. And in talking closely with police, health, early help, youth work teams over the last few years, I found that actually establishing a good understanding of the realities of young people's lives makes system operate better together. But in terms of those constraints, many are finding that in middle and senior management roles, that they're not able to model relational practice between teams and between practitioners, whether through supervision or in meetings, and, as you'll all know, feel a pressure to close cases and limit time on professional development. At the level of senior leadership, in the midst of working on this paper last year, Eileen Munro gave an interview that really fascinated me. She was reflecting back 13 years on the landmark report following her review of children's social care in England, which had been published, I think, in 2011, 2012. And she mentioned that she wished she placed more emphasis on directors spending about half a day of duty every month in direct practice. And I think Josh McAllister in the more recent review made a similar recommendation that all registered social workers would spend, at whatever level they're at, some number of hours of direct practice every year. You'll know better in the social work profession than I do whether that's been taken forward. My sense is it remains a constraint. What Munro seemed to emphasise is that continuity of care doesn't stop being needed just at the level between practitioner and young person or family, that it's something that we need to frame and see present throughout the system. And it's arguable that this kind of gap that emerges between practice at the everyday level and the ways in which our systems are led can lead to defended systems where we end up controlling and prioritising control and stability over the quality of relationships with young people. And I think that's one of the ways in which damage can be done within the system. And finally, at the level of multi-agency partnerships, where over the recent years I've worked as a consultant, often skilled people who are doing their best to respond diligently at all different levels of the system. For example, those outside the statutory system, responding to written information, responding to the request to participate in multi-agency meetings, find themselves sidelined from dialogue, and sometimes at worst, condescension from local authority and other statutory professionals. And very often they're the people that actually know the young person or know the family the best. And in that context, the children and families themselves are in the category of being known to services, and within the context of the multi-agency meeting are not well known by anyone in that context. And in a sense, that reinforces the sort of stigma and labelling and discrimination faced by those who are not well served under the label cannot be helped. Recently, the people in the contextual safeguarding research team came up with quite a simple idea of the value of being known by rather than known to services. And it kind of caused a recognition in me that very often throughout our systems, one of the main constraints is that the people who are trying to help don't have a close relationship with anyone. I fairly recently worked with some head teachers, talking to them about this model. And one head teacher of a massive school, it had like 12 form entry, said to me that his ambition was for every child to be known really well by at least one senior leader in his senior leadership team, which I thought was really cool. And so I thought if you can do it in that kind of massive institution, there's a bit of an idea of how we might go forward with these sorts of ideas. So I'm going to hand over to Luke to think about this from the point of view of the constraints in research and policy frame.
Two things just quickly. Firstly, I think an important nuance in that story about that head teacher is that he said senior leadership team. It was a he, wasn't it? You said he. I'm not. Yeah. He didn't just say we need every student to have a strong relationship with one adult, with one teacher. And I think sometimes there can be this kind of relational loading where, like, within a school context, for instance, everything is on the learning, all the relational practice, all the relational expectation is on the learning mentor or on the form tutor. So for them to talk about the need for that relationship to be at a senior level, I think is important. Secondly, apologies for this ongoing slides omnishambles. It seems like we've got 31 people on the call, each of whom is seeing something slightly different, which is quite remarkable. And I've tried 3 different ways of sharing. And so I think I'm just in the position where I need to apologize now for those of you for whom it's not working properly. For those of you who can see the slides live, just briefly going back, this was the slide that should have been showing when I was talking about attunement, awareness, authentic alliance, and analysis. And we should shout out Juliet Young, shouldn't we, Colin? Juliet Young is an excellent illustrator who did these illustrations for us. And she's not just an illustrator, is she, Colin? What?
She goes by the name of creative clinical psychologist, and her work goes everywhere. People really find her illustrations of psychosocial concepts very engaging and easy to connect with. So I've commissioned her a few times to make our fanciful ideas into engaging cartoons. And
I appreciate that like makes it even worse for people who can't see the slides, because we're now bigging up the slides. But apologies again if you're in that position. So just briefly, last point kind of on these constraints before we switch into a much more positive mode, and Colin talks about the conducive conditions for relational practice. I think I'm always aware, working directly with young people in a part of London where there's significant levels of poverty and inequality, that we're doing young people a disservice if we don't talk about the more macro scale kind of policy context for all of this. So I often talk about 4 I's: inequalities, institutions, interventions, and interactions. And those interactions that parents, professional adults, peers are having with young people are affected by all those other things. The nature of the intervention that a professional adult is meant to be delivering, the dysfunction or functionality and the funding precariousness of those institutions, those organizations, and also wider societal inequalities. Another constraint that I think affects the relational practice that I might be working on with a young person is if their experience of poverty and housing issues and educational exclusion and so on have led them into a position of kind of feeling significantly belittled, or some criminologists use the term structural humiliation, where humiliation derives not just from interpersonal experiences that then affect your ability to form relationships later in life, but also your experience of structural inequalities can have a similarly kind of humiliating effect, which affects your ability to form relationships. And just on the point of interventions, I think there is a clear need for specialist interventions for young people in certain situations that need to be delivered in the right way by the right people. But my concern would be, and this is clear from research I've done and research that there's been elsewhere, is that in some cases there's a kind of over-investment of faith from policymakers, from local commissioners, in the efficacy of kind of specific, discrete, time-bound interventions as kind of silver bullets to solve particular issues in young people, rather than there being an investment in relational capacity within social care systems, or relational capacity within schools, or social infrastructure for young people, where the relationships formed with young people can be longer term, can be more nimble, can be more flexible, can be more adaptive. And then in terms of youth organizations, which can often be a kind of key nest for those relationships with young people, obviously the precariousness and the scarcity of funding has led to a kind of dysfunctional marketplace of provision for young people in worst cases, which again in worst cases has been tied to certain cultures of evaluation that have not been conducive towards forming the right kind of relationships, because you're under pressure to achieve a certain outcome with a capital O and to report on that, and that can incentivize you to skip over the complexities of the relationship in order to just get to that kind of key performance indicator. So think on that macro level of policy, based on my experience and research that I've done, there are those kind of constraints on relational practice as well. That's a lot of constraints. That's a lot of talk about pains and pressures that we face when working with young people. So we're going to switch mode to a more positive one. And for those of you who can see the slide, there is a even more beautiful Juliet Young illustration now on screen.
Thank you. So in this positive mode, we wanted to explore in the paper and in Juliet's diagram conditions for relational practice and how they might be fostered in multi-agency ways and bolstered at each level of a collaborative system. And I'm at pains to say that this framework isn't about telling anyone how to work. We thought of it as a way to get people thinking together across the boundaries of sector and discipline or social work teams. And so far that's gone really well. Like, people have really engaged with it as a thinking tool because it's not a protocol or a model for how you should do the work. It's been inviting dialogue between leaders, managers and practitioners about the kinds of changes that you'd want to see that create conditions at each layer so that what we've been calling relational practice here flourishes. And again, to say this is not only between practitioners and young people, it's between professionals as well. And we recognise that adolescent safeguarding is often quite narrowly defined, and we wanted to more generously define its purpose. So using this set of A's, I think it was 9, I think we've got 9 A's here, we've expanded the definition beyond only prevention of serious violence and exploitation. And I understand those things are done because it's our current criminal justice and community safety policy. And our more generous definition, as we've been hinting at through the talk, is that it's always multi-agency collaboration, and that it aims to create safety, to prevent harm, to nurture well-being and agency with young people, and to recognise that harms are happening in the home and outside the home. And I think the model that you see here and the definition has a number of different implications. And in part, this was inspired by our colleague, the writer and director of research and practice, Des Holmes, who talks a lot about the both and mindset so that we don't slip back into sort of binary thinking. So in each of its pairs, like analysis and attunement or allocation and adaptation, we're thinking both and. So in this way of thinking, we're both centering the agency and well-being of children as the goals of safeguarding without placing responsibility on those children and young people for reducing harms. And I'd seen often in multi-agency child exploitation meetings, for example, real willingness from people chairing the meeting and sat around the table to think in these terms, but then you look at the minutes from the meeting, and it's just a series of actions for young people to do their behaviour differently. So they're all disjunct. I enjoyed that laugh. It wasn't as funny when you were auditing the minutes, but I know you know. So we see this disjunct between the protocol and the practice. I think the second thing this approach and this definition emphasises is the real vital influence of non-professional relationships, online spaces, locations and places, but without that somewhat confusing thing of like, which practice model is it this week? So we intentionally tried not to make this as a replacement to other ways of thinking, but instead a way of saying, how can we sort of bring this together and think about online spaces, non-professional relationships, places, locations. It also extends the notion of safeguarding always beyond the idea of children's social care and always including other organisations, shifting a bit from the language we've had in the last 15 years that says safeguarding is everybody's business, because we know that pretty much often means it's nobody's business. So instead we were thinking about how collaboration is the focus, so that instead of thinking that relational practice is supported by terms of reference or information sharing, that fundamentally this approach to safeguarding is always about collaboration. We had a few debates about whether to use the word system at all. I don't know if before the watershed that I can use Luke's term for this, but let's say it involves something a bit rude, but fundamentally systems get overused as a term. We've kept it because I think it underlines the connectedness of all the elements we've talked about, and I think it indicates that this is a complex and changing context, whether we're thinking about child criminal exploitation or thinking about the direct work that somebody does with a young person. Those are complex and changing realities. And I think that is what the word system says for us, that things are interconnected and changing. I think my favourite bit about this approach, and the thing that I learned from Luke, is that it requires emotional self-awareness at every level of the system. That isn't something that's just the property of a social worker or a youth work practitioner. That's something that belongs to all of us. The curiosity, flexibility, and getting beyond rigid forms of management that should be our hope, that should be our ambition, is inviting us to a bit more emotional awareness, curiosity, and flexibility. And I think what it does is invite us to think as safeguarding professionals in whatever role we're at, that we have a bit of responsibility to understand the reality of a young person in order to strengthen safety in their social environment. And when it comes to social work leaders in management and leadership roles, that creating conditions for an authentic alliance isn't just something that social workers are doing, it's something that you're doing together. And in child protection context, we might think about your opportunity to really hold awareness of the voice experience of reality of a young person in the context of what you're overseeing. And I think that can sometimes go missing. That moment to create attunement with the worker who knows the young person best. The first of the key conditions in all the A's is allocation. And that, of course, on the one hand, is allocation of space for professional development and the time to work on developing these capacities. And we recognise it's not always easy to allocate time to reflection, supervision, and professional development. We've talked about that in the constraints. And I would add that this is not only for practitioners and managers. Directors need space from their executives to make time for reflection. That's not only at the business end of the system, it's all through it. And those conditions have to be created. And I'd say then there's a parallel process so that the attunement and analysis that you see at the centre is needed all the way through, and therefore space needs to be created. The second key conducive condition is adaptation of the delivery and adaptation to the learning that's emerging as you test out the tools. I don't know if Luke's going to mention it today, but as well as the 4 R's and the 4 I's that he's mentioned, he's got 4 T's too. And part of what that's about is saying that we need space in order to understand and develop the tools that we're using. I'm not going to spoil it in case you're going to bring it up. The means for recognising the flexibility around the different types of tools you've got before you, be it trauma-attuned, strength-based or relational methods. And this allows managers the space to make visible in the wider system the kind of learning that's emerging from practice. This idea is about, I sense, making practice present, whether reporting to senior managers what's working, or speaking in multi-agency contexts about practice that you've learned from another sector or discipline. This means some level of recognition of professional knowledge and learning that's being gained by practitioners through their experiences of relational practice. I mentioned earlier that when people appear like they're really good at this, it can seem like it's just natural to them. It's not something they've had to develop. So part of this idea of making our practice approaches and development more visible at leadership levels is also about affording some recognition to this type of work. I want to finish with a thought that's in the paper that's from an organisational consultant and Tavistock person called David Armstrong, who reflects a lot on the emotional life of organisations. If you've come across the idea of the organisation in the mind, that was David Armstrong. He proposed that a neglected function of leadership is making practice present and really thinking about practice and how we do it as the goods of our system. And he talks about it as an act of discernment, bringing into view and articulating what is often going unnoticed or unvoiced or tacit. He emphasises that it's actually the job of leaders to spot the valuable goods within their organisation not just in terms of outcomes or outputs, but in terms of excellent skills in direct practice, how we work best. And so we've proposed that a crucial function of leadership for adolescent safeguarding is to reflect on these capacities of attunement, analysis, the authentic alliance, the conditions you can create for allocation and adaptation as the heart of relational practice and as the valuable goods of our systems, and to recognise it is the practice that breathes life into what we do. And this would lead to a sort of alignment, not only within social work organisations, but across our multi-agency partnerships. And in practice, what this asks strategic leaders and others in leadership roles in our systems to develop better understanding of the lived experience of children, including their cultural, ethnic and structural dimensions. And it would invite our partnership arrangements to think again about relationships as vital infrastructure that we intentionally build to support relational practice between people and between organisations. I would say that we shouldn't take that infrastructure for granted. We shouldn't take for granted the value of relational development. This approach finds its way into everything that we do, actually. It's not only in the direct speaking that we do, it's in the communication, the emails, the messaging. And crucially, when practitioners listen to and act upon the feedback they seek from children, families and practitioners, and they attend to these relational dynamics and complex realities, all these aspects of the infrastructure of our partnership work shape our human-to-human relationships, beliefs and the norms of practice. In effect, they create the conducive conditions or not for relationships to flourish. For any of this kind of strategy work to really make change in everyday practice, the final condition that you need is authority from system leaders and executive leaders, whether they be education leaders, police or social work leaders, working together to make relational approaches a priority. This aligns policy and practice and creates the real commitment to change, which I think is why we're all here. And I'll end on that note to invite questions about what Luke and I have said today.
I think in our plan we go on to a next slide which just says questions and discussion. So okay. I'm going to leave up the diagram instead, but also for those of you who can't see the slides, in this case you're not missing much. But yeah, any reflections, comments?
I certainly heard a chuckle when I mentioned the thing about MACE meetings and the inconsistency with practice. In fact, I saw a few wry smiles as well when I said that, almost as though people had experienced that firsthand.
Marion coming in. Yeah.
I think usually it's a social worker who says that. I see all the action is for me. They usually kind of like would say, and I think what I've been sometimes what's useful is like just talking about that, about things that as an IRO keep on coming back to. But recently I had a very interesting review where the young person wanted to go out and we were trying to get him to just give us some information. So what we went to there and then was just actually said, okay, these friends, we need one of your friends and their parents now to kind of like talk to us. So would you do that? And then you can go. So that kind of took, and it was very interesting because you can get into like, well, you have to do it this way and you can't go if you don't have to do it that way. You know, if you insisted on the official way. So I think it's very, but that also comes to your point that I'd known that young person for quite some time. So he's trying to say, well, you know, I know you and we can try to solve it this way there and then so you can have what you want. But yeah, it's not always easy, I think. And I think I was also chuckling in terms of like being in meetings and as the chair or the child protection chair or the IRO, you're saying something and you can literally feel people rolling their eyes at you, just like, really, if it was so easy.
I think that's such an important point. One of the things we tried to emphasize throughout, Marion, was that often the experience of both practitioners and first line managers is they're expected to just do it without there being structural and system conditions that enable this change. And really appreciate that insight from you there. I see we've got a couple of hands up. Mark.
Hello, I'm a bit of a technophobe, so you'll have to excuse me.
You are excused, Mark.
Yeah, I think you really hitting on something that has been a bugbear of mine for a long time, and the assumption that young people have to have relationships with us, and because of our position and status and the role, and that we kind of pop into their lives and things happen, and it can occur. And I think that you use the word authentic, and I love that word, because if you genuinely have a relationship with somebody, then you know that it takes a lot of time to do that. And I kind of feel that some of our young people will have better relationships with somebody down the road, working in a shop, or the person that they meet on a bus that they use every day, and yet we parachute in and are expected to almost second guess some of this stuff that's going on, and you cannot force it, and it does take time. And I think there is not enough emphasis around that kind of the need to be around and in somebody's aura and presence in order to, you talked about feeling it, that or sometimes I used to class it's like secondary trauma, when you're around someone and you're feeling their emotions, and you've got all this information and you're carrying it, but you can't do anything with it sometimes. And I think that only comes from spending time with people. And me as an IRO, I jump in and out of people's lives, and it's really superficial. But I also think that it impacts on us, because I know sometimes that some of the things I do feels a little bit tokenistic because I'm on a clock. And so I think that, for me, what I would like to see when you're talking about making fundamental changes is that instead of looking at the numbers that you're working with and how many reports you have to do and how many things you do, about how much quality time, not typing, but how much quality time, actual time have you spent with that person? There's a difference, and I think it makes a big difference. And for social workers, I think we need to be encouraging them to kind of live in that space rather than write about it. I think for me, it's fundamental part of youth work and social work. So sorry to drone on.
Thank you for that comment. It made me think of two things that also linked comments in the chat, and I also see Sharon and Adam. The quick thing I wanted to say is that in the spirit of both and, we both know that any young person will have multiple relationships in their life. So they might have a web of support and get different things from different adults. And we know that an enduring professional relationship can be really critical in a young person's life, and that we shouldn't be in a situation of picking one mindset or the other, that actually both are good, but recognizing webs of support and sustaining enduring relationships in direct practice. So that's what that made me think of. Thank you. Sharon, I'm going to come to you next, and then Adam, and then the chat.
Thank you. I think it's a really helpful conversation, and just to echo again what Marion and I've missed was it Mark? Mark that were just commenting on there. I couldn't agree more, although at some level I also think that you can very quickly, on occasion, as I think Luke was suggesting earlier, develop a rapport. In some instance it's circumstantial, isn't it? And I think critically that ability to kind of lean in to that person that does have that key relationship with the young person is critical. And that's where procedures or the misinterpretation of procedures on occasion as well can create a unhelpful point of tension there. So I just wanted to comment on that, and while I'm at it, linked to the families first and the reforms, I'm really interested in this idea that the risk outside of the home approach, that the intention seems to be that we're now bringing that into the child protection conference environment, which of itself can be a really, really constraining environment, and certainly in my experience doesn't always serve children and families well. It does in some circumstances, but again, we need to be able to make judgments and decisions around that in consultation with the child and with the family. And I guess the other thing I was just thinking was about, and Luke, I know that I spoke with you about this before, about the ambit approach. I'm a real fan of the ambit approach as well, because I think one of the things we talk a lot about, multi-agency working, the things that can go wrong in terms of collaboration, actually, that we a term that we bandy around a lot, the need for good communication, but actually multi-agency working can be really, really hard as well, and not least because I think for lots of social work environments, and indeed IROs, those reflective spaces are perhaps more privileged, to us in many instances, I think, and increasingly, whereas for many of our colleagues, they simply are not. So again, some of those tools around, I've been the likes of the disintegration grid, the team around the worker, just being able to come into a space whereby you can think, whereby you have the opportunity to think about, what does this mean for me? What are share those different perspectives that are competing on occasion and creating tensions for the group, but critically are impacting negatively on again, how you're serving the young person. But a really fascinating, really helpful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. On the note of the changes coming through the reforms and the uncertainty about whether that means that some of the child protection work will incorporate harms outside the home in different ways, there have been risk outside the home pathways investigations and research carried out by the contextual safeguarding research team. And more anecdotally, in my experience of working with local places, there remains quite a lot of confusion about what it means to change different parts of the current quite constrained child protection system to incorporate responses to harms outside the home. So it feels to me like it's in flight, like it's still in process, and there's not, in some of the processes that IROs oversee and are involved with, it's not quite clear what next year might look like in terms of the practical consequences of those reforms. I say that sort of diplomatically and generously, I think. I'm going to come to Adam next.
Hi there. Yeah, I really like the way that the whole system is included in what you're doing. I think that's a really helpful way of looking at things, and I'm sure everyone's had experiences of sometimes it's like social workers, you do the relationship stuff, the managers at the top, don't do any of those things. They might not respond to people, they might not talk to people in the way that we want social workers to, so there can be a real sort of disconnect. And I think when you work in an organization where the people at the top will talk to you like they want you to talk to children, young people, I think that makes a huge difference. So I think having that whole organization and whole wider context to it is a really helpful way of understanding things.
Thank you. It hasn't gone down well with everyone, just to say. So although it seems to go down really well here in the context of thinking about the relationship, the management structures and the top system as always containing thinking about relationships between us, we sometimes, there's a phrase that I sometimes use that we're a salad, not a soup, which I borrowed again from Des Holmes, who I think borrowed it from somewhere else, to say we both need to think collaboratively and define what collaboration means, and we need to think about the ways in which we're distinct and we do different jobs. But some people still interpret the diagram that you've just seen as me saying, oh, well, everyone just does relationships practice now, which is clearly not true, right? It's clearly not true that everyone in the enforcement system is changing to more youth work style approaches. That's not happening. So I think I'm glad that you see it, that it's a kind of a model that helps us to think about both difference and relationships throughout. Thank you, Adam. Luke, I wanted to pick up your point from the chat about the time element, if we can.
Oh yeah, I was just kind of reinforcing what's been said about, and having done having spoken about our paper with a few different kinds of professional groups, time always comes up, and these different elements of time. Sufficient time with the young person, sufficient time to reflect afterwards, sufficient time in terms of the longevity of the relationship. And it feels like a moment at which hopefully at a policy level there's an awareness that that time has been squeezed and squashed too much, and there's been too much of a focus potentially on these kind of discrete interventions, and hopefully there is a move towards recognizing the need to resource adaptive, flexible relationships. But that may be, I may be naive in expressing that hope, and I'm usually more of a grumpy cynic. The other thing I wanted to almost ask, like, so we've done this a few times, and every time it is different, and we bring in different things depending on what our experience has been lately. And that chat I gave about the good enough alliance, the slightly Winnicott inspired thing, that's new, isn't it, Colin? I haven't done that before. And I guess thinking about the IRO role, thinking about what you've just said about those in enforcement positions, Colin, I wonder how helpful it is to think about that really, really basic intuitive notion of a good enough alliance or good enough attunement, because what you're then that avoids you saying absolutely everyone needs to form these long-lasting, trusting relationships with young people. And what you're saying is that there's a certain kind of quality of relationship that is needed for different reasons in those different settings. And it's on all of us as the adult professionals to seek to establish that good enough alliance with that young person, and to be reflecting, back to Sharon's point, to be reflecting on what a good enough alliance actually consists of in that particular context. If you're a police officer or an IRO or someone else whose interactions with young people may be relatively fleeting. Sorry, Colin.
If we're waxing improvisatory, then the thing that I've been thinking about, and I did hint at your 4 T's, but one of those is time. The one I want to think about a little bit, I think sews together some of what we've talked about today, is tending. That in a sense, I'm a bit of a gardener. I like to think about the fact that you tend differently over time, and in the life cycle of our work, we're doing different types of cultivating, different types of growing with professionals and with one another and with young people. And you don't need to tend in the same way at different stages of the work. I think part of the problem is we collapse different types of work as though they were all the same, and they're not. But it's not just that we do that as different disciplines, it's also that different tasks are needed at different stages in the journey. And I've found a lack of nuance in thinking about how we apply the different tools that we've got. So the element of that is you're not just developing we all use the word toolkit, so you're not just getting a box, and you're learning how to do those things and applying them at different times and to tend in different situations. So I think that is a part of what we're trying to explore. My hunch is a lot of leaders get detached from what that process looks like, from what it looks like to choose different types of tools, and that there's an opportunity to think about how we tend one another as a system. So that's just to extend that metaphor a little bit more. But that's what I've been thinking about a lot recently, that a lot of this is about cultivating opportunities for people to develop.
Let's bring in Rebecca.
Hi, it's been great to hear some of the discussions, and also Mark, good to see you. Mark was one of my IRAs. I'm based in Leicestershire. We did get outstanding in our last Ofsted last year, and I think it's been really interesting having the conversations, because Leicestershire isn't any different to some local authorities. We still have the pressures, the staffing pressures, the budgets, and I think for me, our leadership team, our senior leadership team, has made such a commitment to our children and young people. Even from our assistant director even emailed me yesterday to say, send a reminder to the IROs that she still sends certificates for personal achievements for our children in care. She's really proud to hear about their achievements. And I think we definitely have kind of like a real sort of family approach in Leicestershire. From our director, assistant director, they model all the behaviours that they expect to see of their workforce. And Ofsted commented, and I think some of our workers even said it felt like a real family to work for. And that it has made a real difference. I think in terms of the IRO role, I never think you know the type of relationship you're going to end up with a child or young person at their very first 28-day review. There's so many complexities in an IRO's role, working with children and young people, you know, like with the social workers, it can be really difficult. I think the other thing I always bear in mind is not only are we working with the child's trauma, we're also working with the family's trauma. You know, these are often families that have had generational interventions, haven't always been as positive as what we would have liked, even, you know, within our time frame of working for local authorities, you know, that our practice has changed so much that, you know, we even kind of how we write Leicestershire writes to the child, all of their records, whether it be their PEP meeting or their you know, review of arrangements report. We haven't quite got the court on board yet in terms of writing to the child, but I do feel I see it on LinkedIn where judges have written specific bits in statements to the child to explain their decision making. We're working in a much more, we've always been accountable, but it feels like we're more accountable now. We're more mindful of people's traumas, people's emotional well-beings. And I think I in Leicestershire, we always try and go in with, you know, the IRO is generally the most consistent person in that child's life. They're going through the front door, which is one team. They might go to a second team for another type of intervention, then they go to the long-term children in care team. They could have had I don't know, like more than 8 or 9 social workers in that period of time. And again, just using the review meetings, I always find helpful to bring it all back in terms of what is the most important thing for now. You might have a long list of things that we need to get through, but what is it now? What's most important over this next 6 months that we need to focus on rather than everything? I will say to my IROs, review meetings can be as formal as what you need them to be or as relaxed as what you need them to be. Some you'll go in for a general chit chat and you'll think, oh God, I hope I've covered everything, but it felt about right. And not to dumb down the importance of the IRO role or review meetings, but others where you've got particular challenges, you do have to be more formal. You do have to bring people more in line in terms of expectations around behaviours and whatnot. But I think it again, it's the IRO's role to accept, in my view, for some young people, you will have a relationship. You check in with them, you see how they're doing. For other young people, they're not there yet in terms of that relationship, and the IRO will continually try and support, but it shouldn't be a reflection on either side that, you know, that relationship isn't quite where we would want it to be in terms of it's just how that relationship is. And I think it's about, for me, just being really realistic with people like with ourselves. We all have off days, we all have rough moments, you know. We expect perfection from our families and the people we're working with, so, and just being kind to ourselves as well, you know, and acknowledging that whole, yeah, it is what it is. But I really honestly, these conversations and these discussions, you know, really bring back the importance of why we do what we do and how hard it is as well at times to, you know, try and do the right thing, but in a system that tells you what the right thing is, even when it's not really the right thing. Sorry, they were just my kind of thoughts on it.
Nothing to add.
And then Team says, we notice you've spoken a lot.
Rebecca, I think you just exactly described a big part of what we were trying to articulate about leaders evincing and taking forward relational practice throughout the system and being human. So that is just delightful. Very much.
Thank you.
I think that's a great moment to end, Sharon, actually.
I've got goosebumps. It's just been a really terrific session, and thank you, Rebecca. But yeah, Colin, Luke, thank you so much. I couldn't thank you more for coming along today. It's been a absolutely fascinating, interesting, conversational piece to what I'm sure will be further conversations and reflections going forward. So what I will do, like I say, is I will upload the recording some stage soon to the website. I'll ping that around, and I'll also upload the PowerPoint slides, if that's all right, Colin, Luke. Yeah, thank you. But yeah, again, just want to say thank you so much, and thank you to everyone that's participated today. Some really helpful reflections as ever, so thank you. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin, Luke, do you just want 5 minutes just to check out?
I
Just
sent you the slides. I think they should have come through.
I'll just turn.
Shall I just quickly,